So hi, everyone. My name is Miggy Torres. I'm a composer and an artist, apparently. I graduated from Ithaca in 2015. Actually, you can go through my background slide. I graduated in like 2015 with a degree in composition. I absolutely love choral music. And in fact, it was weird. I was like the vice president of ACDA when I was a student there, so it's nice to get back to my roots. You know? I started writing choral music in high school. Oh yes, there we are. And from high school, and honestly until since high school essentially, I have been a very big Eric Whitacre fan. In fact, you can see here a colorized version, circa 2010, of the 18-year-old Miggy's Eric Whitacre collection. So that's how you know that I'm one of you. So today, I want to talk about a problem that I had experienced throughout my undergraduate career and even afterward. It's kind of a compositional problem. It's a creativity problem. That was something that I didn't really have the words to describe at the time. Essentially, the music that I was writing kept sounding like the music that I was listening to, which wasn't necessarily a bad thing. In fact, it's actually sort of expected. In traditional composition pedagogy, and even not just composition, but all art, you learn by imitating things you think are awesome. So I remember when I was 18 and I was building up that colorful collection, I would bring it to my basement where I had a little keyboard set up, and I would just play through each Eric Whitacre song like super slowly and just try to figure out what he was doing on a very superficial level. I don't think I had enough of a theoretical understanding to like understand what he was doing deep down, but I was really soaking in all of the stuff that he was doing. And so by the time that I was writing choral music here, my music always ended up becoming this pastiche of Eric Whitacre. It always ended up just sort of trying to be that, not being that, but I didn't know what else it could be. I didn't have an understanding of like, you know, that it could be anything else, or that I even wanted it to be anything else. And in fact, I did want it to be something else, but I just didn't have even a conception that there was anything else possible that would satisfy me. So that was sort of the problem that I was having, and that I didn't really I wasn't able to put into words at the time, where it was that there's all this music around, it all sounds great, and I want to do that, but I don't want it to be that. I want it to be something else. But all I know is that, so how do I find something else? So zooming out a little bit, the music that I was writing was both my own and not my own. And if you had asked me at the time, Miggy, is this piece an authentic expression of your unique artistic identity? I might have said yes, because as far as I knew it was. But at the same time, it also happened to be the same artistic identity, the same expression of an artistic identity that hundreds of other composers writing choral music back then and today, it was only a couple years ago, were using. With similar harmonies, similar gestures and rhythms, etc. The same techniques and processes. And so this problem is something that is, I guess it's somewhat well known in the choral world. Fahad Siadat, who runs Siadat Publishing, which is this publishing house where they have a lot of contemporary music, and they kind of curate it so that choral directors know that it's all really good and that it's all performable and stuff. He wrote a wonderful article series for New Music Box, which is this new music blog and website, and it's part of New Music USA, which is this wonderful grant-making foundation for new music. He wrote a wonderful article called The Future of Choral Music, in which he expressed similar qualms. He said, "Here's a common experience I have as a publisher of choral music. I'll receive a piece with all the hallmarks of a composer who knows what they're doing. The piece is well engraved, follows the rules of voice leading, is idiomatically written for the voice, and is dull. But then I'll do a little sleuthing and find samples of this same composer's instrumental music, which will often by contrast be lively, engaging, and innovative." So there's something about writing for choir that seems to kind of put composers in a corner and kind of tie their hands and somehow psychologically makes them limit themselves in terms of their creativity. So what could be a solution to this problem? Well, it didn't occur to me until relatively recently when I was getting into photography, as a matter of fact, something totally unrelated to choral music, presumably. One of my friends was getting into photography, and then I started getting into it. And I was watching all these YouTube videos about, how actual cameras work and how exposure works and stuff. And one of the things that I found fascinating is that you have to make a very important choice before you shoot, at least with film. With digital cameras it's different, but with film you have to make a very important choice at the beginning of the creative process, which is, do I shoot in black and white or do I shoot in color? And as you can see by these two examples here, each one does something different. Each one says something different. You get a lot of contrast with the black and white version. But there are certain things, especially like this part of this woman's dress and the little dot in front of the, what is that thing, the megaphone, that really pop out. And so depending on what you're trying to express, this creative decision that you're making at the very beginning of the process will kind of limit what your options are moving forward and really determine what the final product ends up being. It's easy to sort of make that decision casually and just say, well, I'll just shoot everything in color, or I'll just shoot it all in black and white, without really considering what it is you're trying to say. And so I was thinking about that, and it made me think, man, what are some of these decisions that I might be making without even thinking about it when I go to write for choir? What are my default settings, as it were, that I don't change and that I just sort of take as a given? And so to explore those questions, I want to get a little bit more philosophical, if you'll allow me to, and talk about another idea that I've been kind of mulling over the last couple of years that I like to call the product-process duality. So let's talk about the creative product versus the creative process. We tend to think about those things as related but separate things. Similar to how maybe about, I don't know, 110 years ago or so, space and time were considered to be separate things. But nowadays, thanks to Albert Einstein, we don't think about it that way. We think about it as space-time. It's one thing that encapsulates both elements. A similar distinction can be made in spectralism. Spectralism is a school of musical, it's like a musical style essentially, where what the composers who write in that style like to do is they'll record like the sound of like a bell ringing or something. And then they'll slow that recording down to like super, super slow. And they'll say, oh, like in this bell sound, there's all these overtones. So the timbre and the harmony kind of become the same thing when you slow it down enough. It's almost how like pitch is rhythm if you slow it down enough. So it's similar with product versus process. It's not product versus process, it's just product process. If we were German, we'd say Produktverarbeitung or something like that. I think I pronounced that correctly. I did take diction when I was here, but I don't speak German. So it's more than just the creative process influences the final product. The creative process really is the artistic artifact. Or rather, the work of art is a detemporalized version of the creative process. So, for example, this sounds really fancy and philosophical, but there's some very concrete examples that we can look at that, that kind of illustrate this. One of the best ones is writing systems. Take a look at this tablet from the Fertile Crescent area of the world. You can see the writing on it is cuneiform, which are these sort of triangular, cone-shaped impressions in clay. And they're shaped that way because the instrument that they use to make those impressions has this little triangle bit over there, right on the side of a reed, essentially. And because it's shaped that way, and because they're using a reed as their writing system, the final product is something that has very straight lines, no curves, and has that distinctive triangular cone shape. Compare that, for example, to this Japanese calligraphy, which is made with a brush. You can see all the curving and sweeping and those little, like, I don't know, bristle marks that you can see as the ink begins to run out. It all changes. It changes the entire form of the product. You could never make that with reeds, for example. Transposing into the artistic world, one of the best examples of this kind of thing is in the works of Jackson Pollock. Do you guys know who Jackson Pollock is? He's a guy who does this kind of stuff. Or he did this kind of stuff. This is Autumn Rhythm number 30 by Jackson Pollock, one of my favorite pieces by him. And they're extremely expressive, but in many ways, it's more than just an expressive painting. It's a record of the creative act. This is not to scale. He would have this particular painting is sort of a wall-sized painting. So the way he would make these, of course, is that he would lay down the canvas in front of him, then he would sort of dance around with a paintbrush and a can of paint and just kind of splatter the paint everywhere. And so, in the same way that the clay tablet is a record of impressions, this is kind of a record of a dance. I have here a short clip of him painting where you'll be able to see. Let's see. Go back a little bit here. Here we go. So you can sort of see, you get that angle from below, which is pretty cool. You can sort of see how, as he's moving his body, that the paint traces those movements. It's almost like it creates a kind of casting of the creative act. Something similar might be like this anthill casting, which is made of plaster, which was just poured down, presumably an anthill, and then dug up. And you get this incredible skeleton of what the ants were digging. Of course, that's not the same thing as digging, but it's kind of a detemporalized version of digging. So returning to this painting, you might expect that this would be very difficult to do with a paintbrush, for many reasons. The biggest one being, well, that it's enormous and that you'd have to have a giant easel. But the second biggest one, perhaps, is the consistency of the paint it wouldn't work out. If you didn't want brush strokes to be seen, you'd have to thin the paint down, but then it would start dripping down the sides. So it really needed to be done that way. Another wonderful painting is La Grande Bataille by Yves Klein, who would essentially put blue paint all over people and then have them roll around on a canvas for a while, resulting in these sorts of things. And you can see handprints, you can see footprints, you can see all sorts of gestures that are embedded in the painting because of the process. It's not something that could be done statically. It's something that you need to move. In the words of T.S. Eliot, the detail of the pattern is movement. This quote is made famous by Caroline Shaw's amazing Partita for 8 Voices. But it originates from T.S. Eliot's, one of his 4 quartets, which are poems, the first one being Burnt Norton, written in 1936. The opening lines of this poem, time present and time past, are both perhaps present in time future, and time future contained in time past. He conceives time imagistically as a single tenseless, deterministic, or mechanistic projection, of infinitely stretching arms of future and past. For T.S. Eliot, time looks the same in all directions. Going further, when you take a look at the original editions of that poem, it had an epigram right at the beginning, which I cannot pronounce. It's in ancient Greek, but it translates to the way up and the way down is one and the same. So it's again kind of echoing that sentiment that time is sort of spatialized and space becomes temporalized. There were other modernists at the time who were feeling similarly to T.S. Eliot. As I mentioned earlier, Albert Einstein's theory of relativity kind of exploded onto the scene in around 1905 or 1915. And so those kinds of ideas were really like hanging in the air very thickly. So things that used to be separate were now really only a matter of perspective. Ezra Pound was a wonderful contemporary of T.S. Eliot. Pound was a modernist poet who really kind of pioneered imagism, and then when it became too hipster for him, everyone like caught on. He was like, okay, well, I'm doing vorticism now, which is basically a different kind of, very similar to imagism, but he was like too cool for it. So the most famous poem of his, that is one of the most short poems, he has really long ones, but one of the shortest ones is called In a Station of the Metro. It's only 2 or 3 lines long, depending on if you count the title or not. It goes, the apparition of these faces in the crowd, petals on a wet black bough. And in this poem, you can sort of see how he's trying to take a kind of a medium, a work of art that is a temporal work of art, a poem, and like compress it down into something that could be experienced really quickly or all at once, like something spatial. He was influenced extremely by, or heavily, excuse me, by Euro-American conceptions of East Asian thought, especially the posthumous ideas of a contemporary of his named Ernest Fenollosa. And this will be the last person that I put up on here from a long time ago because I don't want this to just turn into a history lesson. But Ernest Fenollosa was an academic who was an art historian, professor of philosophy and political economy at Tokyo Imperial University. Of course, this was a long time ago, back when they had any sort of conceptions of things like cultural appropriation or cultural misrepresentation. So by today's standards, he's kind of just an Orientalist. But he edited this wonderful book called The Chinese Written Character as a Medium for Poetry, which is not taken seriously by anyone today, really, in terms of what it means to say about Chinese languages. But it's really more interesting. What's interesting about it is that it reveals the way that he was thinking about language and how Ezra Pound was thinking about language. Kind of got cut off. That's okay. I just want to read you one little section at the end of this, and then we can bring it back to choral music. So from the Chinese Written Character as a Medium for Poetry, which again has nothing to do with actual Chinese. This is just what these European guys were thinking. It goes, a true noun, an isolated thing, does not exist in nature. Things are only the terminal points, or rather the meeting points of actions. Cross-sections cut through action. Snapshots. Neither can a pure verb, an abstract motion, exist in nature. The eye sees noun and verb as one, things in motion, motion in things. Green is only a certain rapidity of vibration, hardness, a degree of tenseness incoherent. No sentence really completes a thought. The truth is that acts are successive, even continuous. One causes or passes into another. And though we may string ever so many clauses into a single compound sentence, motion leaks everywhere, like electricity from an exposed wire. All processes in nature are interrelated, and thus there could be no complete sentence, according to this definition, save one in which it would take all of time to pronounce. Pretty dramatic word, if you ask me. So bringing this back to product process, where Pound considered a noun-verb duality, here we can kind of relate that to a product-process duality. The product is just a cross-section of the product process at one of its terminal points. The process is a set of actions that produce that final result. A painting is an ordered set of brushstrokes. A nocturne is an ordered set of fingerings. And the way in which you compose a work of art, a work of music, and especially the choices that you make right at the outset of creation, embed themselves into the very fabric of that work. Let's look at some examples. So one of the best examples is The Rite of Spring. I don't have like a sound example for this because I assume that you have looked at this in styles or history or something. But this is from that part where it goes jump, 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 jump. And you can see how the chords really fit the hands quite well. My font is a little too big, so it kind of got wonky. But basically the idea is that if you were to like look at that on a piano, it's one chord, it's like one triad and then another triad, or one tertian chord and then another tertian chord stacked on top of each other as one would play it on the piano. And as a result, many of the passages are extremely pianistic. Now, of course, Stravinsky knew what he was doing, and so there's a lot of stuff that isn't pianistic. There's a lot of things like flute arpeggios that you would only really do on a flute. But things like this, you can sort of see whispers of the process kind of poking through the final product. Another piece is really cool, is this piece called Studie über Mehrklänge by a man named Heinz Holliger, who's still alive. He's a Swiss composer and oboist. This would be essentially impossible to play at the piano. It would require, or to compose at the piano. It would require a very intricate knowledge of oboe fingerings, embouchure adjustments, etc. This is a more modernist piece. Mehrklänge means multiphonics. I don't know if you know what a multiphonic is, but a multiphonic is essentially when an instrument that normally plays only one note at a time, through sort of acoustic trickery and witchcraft, they manage to play more than one note at a time. So I'll give you a little taste of this, and you can hear sort of what I mean. That's so cool. What's cool about it is that it sounds like 3 oboes or 1,000,000 oboes, and it's just one oboe. And what makes it really cool is the fact that the sounds that he's making are all transitioning seamlessly into one another. And if you were to just look up different multiphonics in a book, which you can do, you wouldn't really be able to figure that out from a book, because you'd need to know one passes into the other, and how can I move my fingers in a particular way. I'll give you another example that's not quite as avant-garde as this. This piece called Django's Tiger, composed the guitar in 1946 by Django Reinhardt, who is a Romani French jazz guitarist and composer. There's some pretty wild arpeggios at the beginning that are very awkward to play on the piano because they go like, whoa! But on a guitar, you just sort of move your hand a little bit because the strings are all right there. So I'll play a little bit of that for you as well. Here come the arpeggios. So that kind of stuff, where for him it's sort of effortless, but for someone writing, like, you would just never think of it. I mean, you maybe think of it at the piano. I don't know, but it's less likely that you would think of it at the piano. So going again back to product process, while certainly instrumentation shapes the music that's written for it, with choral music, there's something different about it that's actually sort of narrowing just what's idiomatic or what's intuitive on the instrument, narrowing that down into a particular style, where the instrumentation is beginning to imply a style. Sure, that oboe piece was composed at the oboe, and so it's very idiomatic for the oboe, but stylistically, there's tons of different stuff for the oboe. Same thing with piano or guitar. But with choral music, specifically a lot, sort of contemporary choral music, generally speaking, composers end up composing in a style as opposed to expressing themselves. So the instrumentation, there's something about it that's sort of whispering to us and telling us what choral music should be, as opposed to the composer asking what choral music can be. So if a goal of mine is to create more authentic choral music, and I can't expect the product to change unless the process changes. And not only that, but I can only think about the creative product for a certain amount of time until I sort of end up at the conclusion that if I'm going to change the creative process, if I'm going to change the creative product, then I need to think creatively about the creative process itself. So kind of reflexively applying the creative process back to itself. So this idea of meta process, of thinking about the creative process creatively, as opposed to just thinking about the final product creatively, I think is really important in practicing creativity. And I think using those words, practicing creativity, is really important because when we practice creativity, it's very different than just practicing a skill like an instrument or something. With an instrument, you know what it's supposed to sound like. You have an idea of what your idealized model is, and you're trying over and over and over to refine what you're doing to match that idealized model as much as possible. But with thinking creatively, there is no idealized model. You have to just invent something out of the blue. And so the process is different. You can't just refine because there's nothing to refine toward. So thinking creatively about the creative process is something that really needs to be practiced almost apart from the normal kind of skill practice that we're so used to doing. So this is sort of a reiteration of what I said before. But I guess the question then is, well, then how do we go about practicing this thing for which we aren't really taught how to do? I mean, I don't know, at least my experience in music school was very much the other kind of practicing, like practice toward this idealized goal. And it's a wonderful way to help you build a skill. But because of the nature of creativity, where you're trying to think of something that doesn't exist yet, you have to take a different route. And so for me, if you use the word creativity, I think the best context for using the word creativity is in the context of something that already exists. You might say, oh wow, good job, that was really creative, or look at this piece, it's so creative. But if you are embarking upon an exploratory journey of making art out of nothing, then it may be a better strategy, instead of thinking and putting pressure on yourself to be creative, something that is applied to a final product. Instead of doing that, I sort of think about, well, what's the temporalized version of something creative, right? If the product is spatial and the process is temporal, if creativity is spatial, then what is the temporal version of that? And for me, that's curiosity. So really, it's all about curiosity when you're embarking upon the creative process. And meta process, this journey of self-reflection, I think really starts with curiosity. So when you're asking yourself, what's the next note? Instead of asking yourself, what note comes next? Maybe you ask, well, how should I decide what note comes next? And how do I decide to decide what note comes next? Will there even be a note? Is pitch the most important thing in this piece? What about rhythm or timbre? It can be easy, a word of warning, it can be easy to get lost and kind of paralyzed with this line of questioning if you're constantly, I don't know if you've seen the Princess Bride, where the guy has the poison in one of the cups, and he's like, well, but then you would know, that I would know, that you would know, that I would put the poison in here. So you can really confuse yourself if you take this a little too far. But I think one or two steps in is okay. One or two sort of meta levels in the infinity mirror, I think is perfectly healthy. Anything more than that might get a little bit too much. So returning again to default settings, how do we then use this idea to examine how we treat default settings? Well, 4 steps in my opinion. First is we examine what those settings are. We take stock. What are our assumptions when we go to write a piece of choral music? For example, someone says, I want you to write a piece for my choir, and it's a mixed choir. You say, oh great, SATB, and print out a piece of paper. There are like 20 million assumptions you just made by doing that. You know, things like, well, first of all, is it going to be 4-part? Maybe it will be. Should it be one of the sort of standard configurations of choirs, like SSA or TTBB or SATB? If yes, what is doing that? How does that kind of prime your brain when you're thinking about music? If I see a piece of staff paper And we're sort of getting onto my second one, which is how does that affect the final product? The third one, I guess. When you see a piece of staff paper and it's organized with the sopranos on top, and the altos, and the tenors, and the basses, immediately it starts to ask you these questions. It's asking, what's the first note? You've organized your paper in terms of pitch. Up is high, down is low. So already you're sort of saying pitch is really important. Pitch is one of the most important things. Another thing that composers do very often when they set out to write a choral piece is they select a text. And different ways of working with text will affect the final product in different ways. Before I get ahead of myself here, number 4 is what other options do I have? Excuse me. So why don't we move ahead here and we can look at some examples which are sort of what I just said, but I didn't advance the slide while I was saying it. So for example, going back to the idea of SATB, it really a piece of staff paper that's divided that way really. It's sort of telling us that harmony and pitch is really, really important. Whereas timbre and rhythm, sure, they're important, but maybe not quite as important. If you re-examine that, how would it affect your creative process and the final product? So if you then decide, okay, well, hold on, maybe the most important thing is not pitch, maybe it's rhythm. Right? Then maybe you say, well, I'm going to write the rhythm first, and then I'll just fill in the pitches later. Which is kind of the opposite to what we're used to doing, where you say, okay, I'm going to come up with a chord progression at the piano, and then we'll just, we'll embellish that and turn it into something rhythmic. What if instead of dividing the choir with SATB, you said, okay, we're going to do like really bright voices, and then we're going to do really dark voices, or bright voices, medium, dark, etc., etc. How would that change the way that you write the piece? There's a wonderful composer named Augusta Reed Thomas who she teaches at the University of Chicago. I believe she was the composer in residence for the Chicago Symphony for many years. And for her, every musical parameter is allied into one holistic gestalt. So she does this thing called the gestalt web, which looks like this. This is her. I kind of moved it. I kind of rotated it on the side. But what you can see is that aside from sort of just the art therapy of being able to doodle and relax while you're composing, she sort of listed a whole bunch of different things that she wants to really consider as being on the same level as one another within a piece. Things like spontaneity, character, style, timbre, inner life, texture, form, contrast, physicality. And these are things that range from very specific things, like harmonic rhythm, to things that are very abstract ideas, like flux. Like, what does she mean by flux? Let me, I got a caption there that is not animated. So one technique for re-examining default processes might be to write for, or even write at, as many different instruments as possible. And the reason is because it gets your brain thinking about the physicality of the instrument in different ways and different possibilities. When we go to write for choir, so often we'll go to a piano or something, we'll write at the piano, and we'll put our hands down at the piano, and they'll land pretty much where they landed the day before, somewhere that you think is really beautiful and really nice. And you shouldn't shy away from music that you like. I think it's important that composers write music that they like. But if you're trying to come up with something, if you're trying to explore the boundary of your creative expression, to try to kind of discover something new about yourself through the process of writing music, then it doesn't help so much. So for example, if you say, for example, you think about writing string music, and you think, okay, well, when I write for a cello, one of the things that I think about, and a lot of composers think about, is the open strings. What are the pitches that sound when you're not pressing down on them? And for a cello, they're tuned in fifths, starting with a low C. For violin, they're also tuned in fifths, starting with the G below middle C. And And when you write for these instruments, you're always sort of thinking about the open strings, because if you wanted to do double stops, it's much easier to just, finger one note and then play the open string and that note. So you get like a really easy double stop. Or maybe you're worried about string crossings, right? So if you have a really low note, like the lowest G that a violin can play, and you want to leap up to a harmonic on the E string, you have to cross two whole strings to do that. A good violinist can totally do it, but that's something you might want to consider if the violinist that you're writing for maybe isn't as experienced. But what's interesting about this idea is that you can adapt it to anything else. I can adapt it to, say, for example, a piano, or I can adapt it to a choir. And it doesn't mean that you should write for the choir as you would write for a violin, because a choir is not a violin. But the ways, these sorts of initial decisions that you can make when you start to write for a violin can kind of prime the creative process in a way that can help you to make more creative decisions and think outside the box later on when you're writing for the choral instrument. I'm going to give you an example of a really cool technique found in this wonderful piano piece called "The People United Will Never Be Defeated" by Frederick Rzewski, who recently passed away. Wonderful piece. I believe he wrote it for Ursula Oppens in the 1970s. He was a wonderful pianist. And it's essentially a theme and variations. I'm going to be skipping to one of the variations, which uses this really, really cool technique, which I've not done this, but I think it would just be so cool to try to reproduce that with voices. I think it would be amazing. Let's see if I can manage to get it without hitting an ad. Let's see. Further back. Well, that's it, but I want to... Okay, here. This is Miggy. I think it's like on the mix. Okay, I was wrong. It's on the next page. It's in like 10 seconds. Yeah, it's okay, like down here. An hour. Here we go. So I want to explain really quickly what he's doing, because it's like a lot of finesse. Oh man, it's hard to play. What he's doing is, he's playing a chord with like really loudly and staccato on the piano, and then after the hammer has struck the strings, but before the strings have stopped vibrating, he presses down on the sustain pedal, and so all you get is like the very remnants of those sounds. If you were to just push the pedal down and hit the piano really hard, it would just be a giant sustained chord. But he's timing it just like perfectly, so that when you hit it and then like you hit the pedal, you just get like the echo of the thing, and it's amazing. It's super cool, and I can think of all sorts of ways to adapt that kind of thing to a choir. I won't go into detail with those ways because I think it's more interesting and a better kind of creative thinking exercise for people to kind of ask those questions instead of just hearing it from me how I would do it. Another really cool example of this kind of adaptation technique where you sort of prime your brain by starting in one instrumental context, and then before you've gotten too far you kind of move it to another context. Well, maybe not before you've gotten too far, but basically, so this is a piece called Nuits Adieu, which is by Kaija Saariaho, who's a wonderful composer, still alive. She's from Finland, but I think she lives in Paris. A lot of her music is in French. This is a choral piece. So the original version was for vocal quartet and electronics, which I can play you a snippet of. And then 5 years later, she arranged it a cappella for SATB choir, taking some of those electronic sounds and reproducing them with a whole bunch of people instead of just soloists and electronics. So here's a little bit of the first version of the piece. thing to listen for is like those echoes in the background, the kind of reverb in the background. Here's the version, the 1996 version for a larger ensemble. And I believe this is, who is this? This is Norwegian Soloist Choir. Great. So you can sort of hear similar things happening in the background, except it's people making those sounds, which I think is just really interesting. I think even the way that we write for solo voices is different than the way that we write for large ensembles. So I think it can be cool to, even transposing from one context to another, even though they're very related, can be really cool. Pause. Okay, great. So here's just some other practices and processes that can be approached critically, since we're sort of running a little low on time. I sort of mentioned this before. Composer's relationship with text. Is the composer a text setter, or are you a songwriter? Does the text come before the music, or the other way around? Are you allowed to change the text? These are all really good questions that I think we sometimes have one traditional way of doing things. You know, if you go to ACDA and you talk to Eric Whitaker and you ask him, how do you set text to music or whatever, he'll be like, oh, well, with my long hair, like, yo. Eric Whitaker, he'll be like, hey, yeah, first you memorize the music, and then I sit at the piano and I find like a single motif that like brings everything together, and I call it the golden brick, and then I just make the whole thing out of that. And and that's what he does, and that works for him, and it works for a lot of people. But that isn't the only way to go about it. One of the really interesting things about working with text is that it kind of gives you a lot of creative answers, which maybe are answers that you don't really want to have quite yet. The text in so many occasions defines the form. When you run out of text to set, it's over. For the most part. I mean, you can repeat it, but basically it's over. A lot of composers don't like changing the form of the text, which I understand. They want to keep the poet's, what they perceive to be the poet's original intent with the text, and keep, don't do as many repeats, or don't do any sort of shuffling around. And so it can kind of tie your hands creatively, or kind of force you into doing certain things that maybe you weren't ready for, that you didn't want to do. Of course, sometimes that relationship is really nice between a composer and a poem or something like that. But what's interesting about people who compose for choral music, and especially people who compose a lot of choral music, is that oftentimes that's all that they do, is they set text to music. And again, it's a wonderful thing to be able to do that, but sometimes there are other ways of thinking about music that you may only kind of be able to approach without some other work of art that's kind of creating this artistic scaffolding for you to buttress your work on. When I first started writing instrumental music, it was a crazy experience. I had no idea how to even structure a piece of music, because where are the words? Right? Like, how do I know when it's over? I don't know. And that took a long time for me to get comfortable with the idea that like you can have a narrative that's only told through sound, and it helped me to kind of build a lot of different skills. Other things that we might approach critically are ideas of accessibility. I think that this is a whole hour-long talk in itself, but the word accessibility is almost kind of a buzzword nowadays, and it's thrown around so much without kind of a really solid definition of what it really means. Accessible to whom and accessible in what way? Do you mean the audience? Well, which audience? There's so many different audiences, and they're all very diverse. Do you mean the choirs? Well, choirs are all different, and they all have different ideas of what they want to do, and what excites them, and what scares them, and what first scares them and then excites them, etc. And words like idiomatic. Well, what do you mean by idiomatic? Do you mean music that looks like all the other music that has been written for that instrument? Because you can make your piece like that, but you can also do your own thing. And so for me, when I think about what does it mean for a work to be idiomatic, I usually just keep it very broad in general, and I say idiomatic music is music in which the composer is considering the physicality of the performance. Very, very broad definition. If you write a piece of music and it's hard, you better know that it's hard, and then you better decide whether you want to keep it hard, or whether you want to make it easier, depending on the needs of the ensemble, the time constraints. Is this a piece they're going to be learning on their own? Is this a piece they're going to be sight reading? All these questions are things that come up. But if it's something that you know they're going to be able to spend a lot of time with, then maybe you do make it harder. Ideas about like brain-heart dichotomy is another one. The subject matter of a lot of contemporary choral music tends to rotate around a similar group of things. Things like longing, or God, or love, or death. All things that are very worthy of artistic exploration. But it kind of leaves out other parts of the human experience. Things like, things that are really brainy. Things that are kind of offbeat. There's this sort of neo-romantic idea that if a piece of music is really intellectual, that it can't be emotional. I don't know where that comes from. I think it comes from sort of the way that we teach music theory. When we first encounter Mozart, we don't encounter it. Most of us don't encounter it in a theory class. Most of us have heard it on the radio, or from our parents, or in a concert hall. We don't encounter it for the first time in our theory class. But for most of us, the first time hearing, say, a Webern string quartet is in a theory class. And the context is, check it out, we can represent this with numbers. And so we think, oh, this piece is just numbers. Like, the cool thing about this piece is that it's numbers. Well, that doesn't seem particularly interesting, without really remembering that it's music. It's meant to be, it's expressive, it's emotional. Even though it's brainy, it's still emotional. And then another thing to consider is also the role of technology. Virtual choirs got extremely popular over the pandemic. And I think it's really interesting to consider some of the things that virtual choirs afford us that conventional choirs can't afford us. Things that we would maybe consider taboo in conventional choirs. Things like multi-tracking, or even things like auto-tune, or things like special effects, added reverb, weird distortions of someone's voice that you could never do live, but you do either as a studio recording or a virtual choir or something like that. All of those things offer us wonderful opportunities for expression. I will do the only plug that I will do in this entire thing is for a piece of mine called On the Fractured Identity of the Millennial. I realized that now, when I wrote this, all the people in school with me were millennials, and now all people in school are Gen Zers. But I feel like it still holds true.
Years later they'll tell how they stood in the rain for hours just to get a glimpse of the one who taught them to hold on a second longer. It keeps us honest, noble, even though sometimes we have to be steady and give up the thing we want the most. Even our dreams, even our dreams, our dreams, mine.
It's just a 1-minute snippet, but the whole thing's like 16 minutes long. You can find it on my website if you're interested. But with this piece, I was really thinking a lot about vaporwave and about what would it be like to kind of transfer sounds of technology into a choral context. And with this piece was multi-tracked with the intention of sort of listening to it through headphones. So I wasn't as concerned with live acoustic things, more with like how it sounds coming out of the microphone. So some concluding remarks. Excuse me. First of all, probably the biggest thing overarching is that developing a sense of artistic identity takes a lot of time. It takes years. It's something that I am still working on, and that even composers who are like 3 times my age are still working on. It takes consistency and a different kind of practice, the kind of practice that we talked about only a little while ago. A kind of practice that's really about curiosity versus trying to match a particular style or ideal or your favorite composer or a particular thing you did before or something like that. When you're deep in the creative process, it's important not to try to worry about writing a really, really great piece, because that's already a vague idea. Like, what does that even mean? You haven't written it yet. How do you know if it's going to be great or not? What does that even look like? And if you know what it looks like, then what are you worried about? Because if you already know what it looks like, you just write it. So you clearly don't know what it looks like, so stop beating yourself up about it, because you're not, that hasn't been written yet. I think it's more about writing what excites you and exploring what really stimulates your curiosity. So, in conclusion, I think that questions are more valuable than answers to the composer who's trying to really explore. The word explore comes from the Latin explorare, which it's a hunting term. It means to cry out when you're out in the wilderness. And really, that's something that I think about a lot when I'm trying to practice curiosity in my writing. Is that I'm kind of out in the wilderness, and it might be a little bit uncomfortable, but I'm discovering something about myself and about the world around me. I care about journeys more than destinations, paths more than boxes or voices. A lot of times we hear this idea of, oh man, I'm really trying to find my voice. But what happens when you find it? Do you just stay there and do that over and over again? Some people do, and it works for them, and I respect it. But the composers that I love the most are the ones that are constantly challenging themselves with new ideas. People like Stravinsky, people like George Ligeti, who has some amazing choral music. He has some early choral music that he wrote before he left I think he left Romania or something. And then once he got to Germany, he started getting way more modernist and wrote pieces like Lux Eterna and the Nonsense Madrigals, which he wrote for the King's Singers, which are really wonderful pieces, very challenging pieces. Extremely challenging, especially rhythmically, but man, they are beautiful and they are just a wild ride. And finally, I think authenticity is really more valuable than ideology. It's 2021, and debates about tonality versus atonality, I feel like, who cares, everything is fair game in the postmodern world. It's, one of the hallmarks of postmodernism. There's a wonderful book called Postmodern Music, Postmodern Listening by Jonathan Kramer, which he kind of talks about postmodernism. And one of my favorite things that he says in that is that postmodernism is ahistorical. It doesn't believe in grand narratives like modernism does. It doesn't believe in a sense of linear progress where you start with Renaissance music and you end with Pierre Boulez or something else. In many ways, Renaissance music is more like music that Pierre Boulez was writing than it was like Baroque music or like classical music. And so for the postmodernist, really, you're sort of allowing yourself to be eclectic and to take things from any time in the past and bring them into the present, almost like Ezra Pound would have done in his poetry, and mix those with your own impressions of the world around you. So to kind of close out this entire thing, I think I want to give Philip Glass the last word. I'm not a huge fan of Philip Glass's music, but I think he has a really wonderful thing to say. I think right now, if you tell someone, hey, I'm a choral composer, they might have a very good idea of the kind of music that you write. Well, maybe that's a correct idea, maybe that's incorrect, but there is still this kind of impression that comes about when you say that I'm a choral composer. So in the words of Philip Glass here,
one of the things that was true when we began writing music in the 60s, if someone said to you, I write modern music, you knew exactly what it sounded like. if someone says to you, I write my music, you have no idea what it sounds like.
And that's kind of my dream, where when you say I write choral music, people won't think of Morton Lordson and Eric Whitaker and whoever else. They'll say, oh my gosh, like, tell me more. Like, what kind of choral music do you write? So that's my dream for the future. So thank you so much for listening. And if you have any questions, LMK, and I'll be happy to answer them. Anything? No pressure.
Yeah.
It's a lot, sorry. I kind of like hit you with this like big like aesthetics, history lesson, quantum physics. And then I was like, I don't remember what I did after that. I don't even remember. And I was there. So if you have any questions, feel free to let me know. Instagram, email, website. I guess I lied when I said I was going to do one plug. I'll do two plugs. My second plug is that a lot of these ideas are summed up and elaborated on in an article series that I have on my website called What Can Choral Music Be? If you go to miggytorres.com/WCCMB, it'll direct you to my website where you can read my articles. There are a few that I think I have to go back and edit, especially the ones at the beginning. I think I was a little too passionate at the beginning. I think maybe a little too polemical. But yeah, you can feel free to, if you're interested in this, feel free to email me or go on there and read more about it or whatever. I don't care. I mean, I do care. I'd love to engage with you on this. Yeah, I don't know. I might be developing that into a book length work, but we'll see how things go. I have a lot of pieces due, so I don't know. Great. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.